This is another short video lecture on hazardous waste management and municipal waste management. I mentioned previously that a law titled the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act was passed in order to designate how our waste was supposed to be disposed of. This law was passed in 1976. It also provided definitions for the difference between non-hazardous waste and hazardous waste, and then municipal solid waste. So a different law that was passed 4 years later in 1980 was the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, listed up here at the top of your screen, also known as CERCLA, and it has a nickname of the Superfund Law. This law differs from the RCRA law of 1976 because it deals with past releases of hazardous substances into the environment. In other words, past occurrences where improper disposal occurred that resulted in chemicals being released into the soil, into the groundwater, into streams, rivers, or into the air. Prior to 1980, we didn't have any law in place that put requirements on cleanup or put requirements on how that waste was to be disposed of. So we're going to talk about CERCLA a little bit. This law set up a monetary fund for identifying sites where releases of hazardous substances had occurred onto the land, into the groundwater, into the surface water, or into the air, as well as the biota. For each site, they were to study how much threat there was to human health. And when I refer to they, meaning the environmental consultants and engineers that were hired to investigate the site itself. Then the sites were prioritized, and the worst sites for cleanup were put on the National Priority List, also known as the NPL list. Once the sites were listed on this NPL list, funding became available to do further investigation and cleanup. The whole goal was to identify sites that posed a risk to the public and the ecosystems, and to rank them in order of risk, and to focus on investigating and cleaning them up. In addition, this law provided a requirement of liability for any persons that were responsible for releasing the hazardous waste into the environment. So basically the government would put the funds up front and allow the government monies to be used to investigate and clean up the site. And if the owner wasn't known at the time, that investigation would still occur. Then background property records and deeds were pursued to find out who had owned the property historically and who may have contributed to the environmental contamination. And then those persons that had previously owned the properties were pursued and held liable for releasing hazardous waste into the environment if they could provide cause and effect. So the reason it's called Superfund is because there's a fund available for cleaning up environmental contamination when no responsible party could be found, or perhaps the responsible party was bankrupt and couldn't pay for the cleanup. So to date, there's about 1,450 sites on the National Priority List. 1,330 of these are taking on cleanup, and there's about 59 sites proposed to be listed, of which 35 definitely need to be cleaned up. Since 1980, when CERCLA went into effect, about 757 sites received all the necessary cleanups, and 226 sites have actually been crossed off the list. Actually doing an investigation of one of these sites can take about 10 years, and it could cost over $16 million, depending upon the extent of contamination. Some sites can even take longer, maybe 20 years. So CERCLA is based on the principle that the polluter will pay for the cleanup. The government used the Superfund money to initiate the investigation and clean up the NPL site. Then the government tracks down the responsible parties and holds them liable for the cleanup costs. In cases where the liable parties are not found or are bankrupt, the government will just pay for the cleanup. To date, only about 25% of the cleanup costs have been paid for with public funds from the government. In other words, liability was assessed, responsible parties were identified, and they were held responsible and liable for paying for the cleanup. The CERCLA law was passed in 1980 after a historical chemical contamination event happened here in the United States. It occurred near Niagara Falls, New York, and was called the Love Canal. The Love Canal was named after William T. Love. He started to build a canal and to connect the two levels of the Niagara River, which was separated by falls, back in the early 1900s. The land was eventually purchased by Niagara Power and Development Company. In 1920, the Hooker Chemical Company was given a license to dump waste material into the canal. About 21,000 tons of hazardous chemicals were dumped in the Love Canal between 1942 and 1953. Please understand that at that time there were no laws saying what you could or couldn't do in regards to chemical waste disposal. The Love Canal site is about 70 acres, and it included a 16-acre hazardous waste landfill. When Hooker Chemical Company decided to dump waste between 1942 and 1953, they actually lined the canal with a thick clay layer to form a barrier. Now, in today's terms, landfills can of course be an environmentally acceptable method of hazardous waste disposal, assuming that they are properly sited, managed, and regulated, as well as properly constructed and designed. The Love Canal incident will always remain a perfect historical example of how not to run such an operation. Now, Hooker Chemical Company ended up wanting to leave the site, and as a result, they capped the canal and they sold the property to the school district for $1. And there was a caveat that was signed absolving Hooker Chemical from any and all future litigation. So the school board basically absolved Hooker Chemical from any potential issues that could arise from building a school on the land. In 1954, the school board begins constructing an elementary school, and during the construction they actually found 2 dump sites. The school board then moved the school about 85 feet farther north. So about 100 homes were built and a school was built directly adjacent to or on top of the old canal where the waste was dumped. 400 children began attending the new school, and an incident happened in 1955 where about a 25-foot square area crumbled, exposing drums of waste in the subsurface. This subsequently filled with water, and children could be playing in this water and getting burns on their skin. In 1957, the city of Niagara Falls constructed a sewer for the residences in the area. Construction efforts broke through the clay wall that had been installed originally by Hooker Chemical and allowed chemicals to migrate and seep from the canal. In addition, in this area, the LaSalle Expressway was constructed, and it too restricted groundwater from flowing to the Niagara River. This then created a situation where the canal turned into an overflowing pool from the subsurface up. Residents in the 1970s noticed unexplainable health problems, and in 1976 they began protesting due to health concerns. Basically, they found out that their homes and school was built on a toxic chemical dump. Again, please remember that we had no federal laws in place regarding hazardous waste disposal until CERCLA was passed in 1980, and then RCRA was passed a few years earlier in 1976. So in this community, once they found out that their homes and school was built on a toxic dump, they started to talking to one another. They realized that they had unexplained illnesses. There was an increased number of miscarriages in the neighborhood. There was mental loss. They felt that these health concerns defied United States statistical averages. In fact, the miscarriage rates in that region was 50%, and they were finding that this community had an unusually high number of newborn deformities, people with blood disease, cancer occurrences, epilepsy, and hyperactivity. About 5 of 24 children in the area born had birth defects. And then After 17 pregnancies in 1979, only 2 normal children were born. The rest all had problems. Adjacent to the Love Canal on 96th Street, 15 homes, there were 8 people that developed cancer in a 12-year period. 6 women had breast cancer, 1 man had throat cancer, another man had bladder cancer, and a 7-year-old boy had convulsions and died of kidney failure. So the homeowners definitely had a concern and valid need to oppose what was going on and where their homes were built. However, they were unable to prove that the chemicals on their property were from the Hooker Chemical Company, and hence they didn't have any proof of liability. Now, by 1978, this whole incident became a national media event because the residences continued to protest it. An event that happened in 1978 was a record amount of rainfall that resulted in chemical waste oozing to the surface. Corroding waste disposal drums could be seen breaking up through the ground of the backyards of people's homes. Trees and gardens were turning black and dying. One entire swimming pool had been popped up from its foundation, afloat now in a sea of chemicals. Puddles of noxious substances pooled on the ground surface. Some of these puddles were in yards, and some were in basements, and others were on the school grounds. Everywhere the air had a faint, choking smell, and basically kids were playing out in the yard and getting burns on their hands and faces because of the exposure to the chemicals. When this incident happened, it again became a public outcry and in the news media, and on August 7, 1978, President Jimmy Carter announced a federal emergency state where basically monies were made available in order to purchase people's homes that were affected by the chemicals oozing up from the subsurface. About 220 families moved, and about $7 million was laid out for the purchase of homes. This is the first time a state of emergency was declared for a non-natural disaster event. Like, it wasn't caused by a hurricane or a tsunami or an earthquake. It was caused by an old toxic chemical dump. So, the severity of the site's contamination ultimately led to the creation of federal law that stipulated how to manage and dispose of hazardous waste. The legislation is titled CERCLA, and the law was passed in 1980. Then in 1983, the EPA listed the site, the Love Canal, on the Superfund's national priority list and began to work with New York State to clean up the site. In 1999, the EPA and the New York State Department completely cleaned up the site, and the site was deleted from the national priority list in 2004. As a result of all the cleanup actions, the site no longer presents a threat to human health and the environment, and as of 2004, the EPA had removed the site from the Superfund's national priority list. As a result of the revitalization efforts of the Love Canal area, the new homeowners have actually moved back into areas of the site, and more than 260 formerly abandoned homes in the area were rehabilitated and sold to new residents, creating a viable new neighborhood. So the site's been cleaned up and people have been able to move back. But that wasn't until 2004, 30-some years later after this became a public outcry. This is a map depicting the location of Superfund sites across the United States. Every triangle depicts the location of a Superfund site. Notice that there's a high density of Superfund sites located near Philadelphia, New York, and especially in the state of New Jersey. These sites require long-term response to clean up hazardous contaminants. By the way, the color theme on this map also depicts the density of Superfund sites on a per capita basis. So, number of Superfund sites per 1 million in population. In Vermont, New Hampshire, and Montana, you have between 15 to 20 Superfund sites per 1 million people living in that region. Pennsylvania is in the 7.5 to 10 Superfund sites per million people in population. Now this is based on per capita. So I want to express to you that the following states have the most number of MPL sites listed within their geographic political boundaries. The top 5 states with the most number of Superfund sites are: first is New Jersey with 116, second is California with 98, third is Pennsylvania with 95, Fourth is New York with 93, and fifth is Michigan with 69. So Pennsylvania is ranked third in the nation with having the most Superfund sites that are still being cleaned up.